Good afternoon, bon après-midi. Welcome to this edition of the Physical Society Colloquium. I'm coming to you live from the brutalist majesty of the Rutherford Physics Building at McGill University in beautiful downtown Montreal, where the coffee residue in my mug is about 13.77 billion years old, but where the Wi-Fi is free and plentiful. If you are in the Zoom session and you prefer not to be recorded or live streamed, please log out of Zoom and join us via YouTube. This afternoon, we will have a 45-minute talk followed by 15 minutes of questions and answers. To ask a question in Zoom, please use the raise hand feature following the talk. To ask a question in YouTube, please enter it into the chat. The questions will be relayed to me by my sidekick following the talk. After the Q&A session, the live stream and recording will stop. Professors will be asked to log out of the Zoom session, and undergrads, grads, and postdocs, as well as other non-faculty in the Zoom session, will be invited to the après colloque, a chance to get to know the speaker in a more intimate setting. With that, I will now pass to Professor Adrian Liu to introduce the speaker. Adrian.
Thank you. So it's an absolute delight today to welcome Professor Renée Hložek to give our first Department of Physics colloquium of the new year. Professor Hložek got her doctorate at Oxford University, where she was a Rhodes Scholar, and following that, worked as a Spitzer postdoctoral fellow at Princeton University, and since 2016 has been a faculty member of astrophysics at the Dunlap Institute at the University of Toronto. So Professor Hložek has been honored in many, many different ways. She is a TED Senior Fellow. In 2016, she was named one of 100 South African trailblazers. She's a University of Toronto Science Leadership Fellow and has won the Dean's Faculty Merit Award multiple times, in fact. She's a CFAR Azraeli Global Scholar, as well as a Sloan Research Fellow. So Professor Hložek is a cosmologist and is an expert in all sorts of problems, both theoretical and observational, problems in cosmology across a whole wide range of probes, whether we're talking about the cosmic microwave background, type 1a supernovae, baryon acoustic oscillations, or weak lensing, and all sorts of other probes of our universe as well. She holds leadership positions in a large number of high-profile international collaborations. For instance, with Simon's Observatory, she is the chair of the Collaboration Council. She is part of the Atacama Cosmology Telescope and the Canadian Euclid Consortium. She's the Deputy Analysis Coordinator for the 1,000-person-strong collaboration in the Dark Energy Science Working Group of the Vera Rubin Observatory, which I guess we'll hear about now as Professor Hložek tells us about separating wheat from chaff, photometric classification in the age of LSST. So take it away, welcome.
Thank you so much. That was great and super embarrassing. Thank you so much. I appreciate the introduction. Merci de m'avoir ici. Je suis très heureux d'avoir la chance de parler au sujet des étoiles et Rubin Observatory, et choses comme ça. So of course, if you have given or observed a lot of science talks, you know that we often have super boring titles. And I always get sad when I have to have super boring titles, so I decide to always improvise. In fact, this time I improvised not once, but twice. So you can either pick separating the wheat from the chaff, or you can pick, no, of course it doesn't. Ooh, let's actually press play. That would be better. See if that works. Or you can pick, how do you solve a problem like cosmology if you are like me and enjoy musicals. But in all seriousness, it's great to give a talk about stuff that I'm doing within the Rubin Observatory. But as Adrian said, I have a lot of different science interests. And so I'd love to come and speak to you again about axions, about the CMB. So just please keep inviting me. Hopefully soon enough, I'll be able to come and be there in person with you as well. So I understand there are lots of different interest levels in the room and different scientific expertise. So I'm going to try and explain what I'm doing and see that it's relevant to everyone. If you're not interested particularly in transients, there's still a lot of cool data science and cosmology that you can do with these objects. If you are interested in data science and you don't really care about supernovae at all, there's some interesting stuff here, and I would encourage particularly undergrads and grad students to use some of the things that I'm talking about here. And also, if you're just a Canadian and you want to understand what's coming in terms of observational cosmology, there's something in this talk for you too. So we'll start just by setting the scene, why I care about transients at all and why I care about supernovae. And this is an image that was taken by an artist at a time when I lived in New York City. So it was the time of Hurricane Sandy, and there was a huge blackout in New York City, and you couldn't see any streetlights at all. And I love this photo because to me, it captures the idea of a standard candle much better than a candle in space. Because if you're under the age of 30, you don't use candles except just to light your bathroom, right? If you were crossing the road in New York City at this time, you can see there's an oncoming car. You would use the brightness of the headlamps of the car to figure out if the car is close to you or not. And if it is too close, you wouldn't cross the road. But you may ask, how do you know how to do that? Well, first of all, it requires that you've lived in a city and you've calibrated your eyes and your responses. But also it requires that there are standards that mean that the headlamps of a car are put in with standard brightness. If that wasn't the case, if we didn't have standards, then there would be no way to make sure that you didn't get hit by a car if its headlamps were very dim, for example. And so we use this concept in space, of course, as well, to understand, to use supernovae as beacons in the universe that will allow us to measure distances. And we care about distances because we care about how the universe is expanding, and we care about how the universe is expanding because it tells us something about what the universe is made of and how it's going to change. So in order to do supernova cosmology, we first need to find them. So I'll start talking to you about how we classify supernovae with the PLAsTiCC challenge. I'll then talk a little bit about how we can use this data set and these ideas to really make the best use of our follow-up resources to do the best cosmology we can with this large volume of data that we're going to get. And then I'll, if there's time, just touch on, why do we care about this for cosmology? What's next? How do we use this data? And then describe the requirements that we actually have for the large survey of space and time on the Rubin Observatory. And this is something that I think is maybe not always understood by those who aren't directly involved in the Rubin Observatory. If you're interested, there are some archive numbers for some of the papers. I'm going to sort of just refer to them by author name, but there are some of the numbers that you can take a look at in the future. Okay, so this is a simulation that was done of the night sky by Yusra Al-Sayed and Andy Connolly for what was then the Large Synoptic Survey Telescope that has subsequently been renamed to the Rubin Observatory. And this survey, the sort of simulation of the sky shows us what we expect, that there are lots of objects that are flickering, that are changing their brightness in the sky at any time. But we haven't historically had a telescope that is able to scan both wide and fast. So it can do a large area of the sky, and it can do that to a very unprecedented depth, and it can do it repeatedly. So the Rubin Observatory will be able to scan the entire sky once every 3 days. What does that mean? What will we get from that? Well, I'm part of the Dark Energy Science Collaboration, which is the largest scientific collaboration attached to the Rubin Observatory. And we will be using the survey that comes from the Rubin Observatory, which has been renamed the Legacy Survey of Space and Time. So we get to keep the acronym LSST. And the data products that result will be varied, many and varied. So there are two kinds of surveys. There's the wide survey, the wide, fast, and deep survey. And then there are, which is going to cover most of the sky, visible from Chile. And then there will be smaller patches, which we call the deep drilling fields, which will have exquisite resolution, exquisite depth, and allow you to build sort of very good samples of objects like supernovae, and also to calibrate things like photometric redshift estimation. So the deep drilling fields will be about 10 square degrees, and the wide each, and there'll be 5 of them, and then the wide field will be sort of 18,000 square degrees. Exactly how we design the survey cadence is something that we're working on right now. And in fact, I'm part of the cadence optimization committee, because it has an impact on not just one science case, but multiple science cases. We've got weak lensing, large scale structure, strong lensing, the transient science, supernova science, just to name a few. Focusing on the supernova science case for a second, it's important to contextualize where the LSST survey will be with respect to other surveys. So this is a plot made by Dan Skolnick, which is almost a little bit old now, but that shows the sort of current state of the art, which includes the Pan-STARRS survey, which was another fast survey that filled in data sort of in the mid-plane. And then you'll notice the very low redshift objects. We've got some historical ones from the past, and then some 800 supernovae will be added by the Foundation survey. And then there are some very high redshift sort of HST supernovae. The key thing is that if you take a look at the scale of this graph, it's going to come up again later, you'll notice that the range roughly is, sort of like half a magnitude plus and minus in the bottom scale. So this has been normalized by subtracting off the best fit cosmology line. And LSST will add about 400,000 supernovae to this plot. So in total, we have, of order 8,000 supernovae, and we're going to dramatically increase the numbers of supernovae. So unless we really know what to do with them and how to find them and how to make sure that they are, in fact, the supernovae that we expect, it's going to be quite difficult. Now, people have been interested in classifying different kinds of objects into different types for a long time. Anyone who's interested in R.R. Lyry or AGN wants to study them on their own and wants to sort of filter out all the rest of the stuff. But until our survey came along, no one had really simulated all of these objects together. And so in order to discuss this plastic challenge and the simulations that result, we need to just look at how objects transients can look in the sky. Either you can have something that brightens and fades, or you can have something that just brightens once and then kind of fades away, and then we'll do that same thing again. So we can have variables, there are transients. And this is an example like curve from LSST, and you'll notice a couple of things. The first is that there are gaps in the data. There are seasonal gaps depending on the time of year that you can observe, but then also the data will be of varying quality depending on the light conditions and the moon and etc. And so LSST will have a lot of objects that we need to classify, but we weren't entirely sure a couple of years ago if we were ready to handle the volume of data that we have, given the classification tools and algorithms that we already had in existence. And so we developed the Photometric LSST Astronomical Time Series Classification Challenge. If you haven't figured it out, that is why the acronym is so mangled with small letters and big letters. But this is a challenge. We wrote a small grant to the corporation, LSST Corporation, and got together a group of people to try and say, well, can we simulate a large data set so that not only we, but other people could try their hand at classifying different kinds of objects. So the first thing we did we put a call out to the community to say, what models of interesting things in the sky are we missing? What models do you think have to be included? And do you have spectral energy distributions or light curves for these objects that we could use? We had, I should note that subsequently, the challenge is over now, all of these models are actually available. So not only do you have simulations of an LSST type survey, but actually the models themselves are available, and so that people can resample them for any survey they like. So here's just some example of models. We have type 1a supernovae. I should say these again are the 6 bands that we expect for LSST, for the Rubin Observatory. And we have core collapse objects. We have kind of interesting kilonova type events. We have AGN with some variability. And then we have, tidal disruption events, etc. There were also some, so you can see a combination of galactic and extragalactic objects, because we know that that's what we'll get in the sky. We're not going to get a cosmology specific survey and then a stellar survey at all. Okay, now the other thing we did is we thought we didn't discriminate about whether or not models had already been observed to put them in the simulation, because we know that some models we haven't found just because they're rare and we haven't been looking hard enough or frequently enough. And so we included some interesting theoretical models that haven't been found before, and we decided to combine them in an interesting way. And we didn't allow people to see some of these models before we ran the challenge. So what does that mean? Typically, when you run a challenge like this, you have either you have a training sample, so you get data with labels that we tell you here are light curves, and these are what they are. So we've labeled them already. And you can see here, we had about 14 different types of objects that we gave to the challenge participants. And then when we actually gave when we asked them to run their algorithms that they've now trained on the training sample, to run them on a test sample, we first of all increased the volume of objects that we asked them to classify, but we then included some of these additional interesting models that they had never seen before, because we were interested in asking the question, can you flag that something is interesting even if you don't know what it is? And so we called this the other type, or class 99, which you'll see me talk about a little bit. Okay, how do you generate the model? I won't go into too much detail here, but basically you take this pristine model that we got from the community, you then add effects like extinction and peculiar velocities, and then you simulate the way it would look for something like the Rubin Observatory or the LSST survey. So you add, your cadence of your observing, your 0 points, and all those additional systematic effects. And then you trigger, you say, I want to make sure that I only include this object if it has been bright enough in 2 consecutive epochs so that I can find it, much in the way that we find data through a difference image. I look at something today and I look at something tomorrow. I take the difference between those images and I see if there's a bright spot there before. I have to be able to detect that bright spot for more than 1 day to include it in my final sample. Now, if you're interested in models that vary very rapidly, they would have been lost in this initial sample, but I'll talk about that a little bit more in the end. Okay, so the challenge in its entirety included more than 1 million new SCDs from the community, and we had 15 classes in our final set, and as I said before, 1 class was not represented in the training set. Overall, there were 3.5 million objects that you were tested on as a participant, and you had to have done that by only training on around 8,000 objects. So you'll see there's a huge imbalance in the number of objects you were given to train and the number of objects you were given to test. And initially, when we talked about this for the community, people asked us to make the data representative. But of course, we don't get that luxury in astronomy, because we know that the Rubin Observatory is going to open up the sky to a lot of objects, the large volume of objects that we've never encountered before. And so we really wanted this non-representativity, both in type and volume, to be present to handle. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. Okay, so I'll go super quickly over this. We had to do a lot of validation. It sounds like a very time-consuming and stressful job, and in fact it was, but it's very important. And a good anecdote that we like to tell folks about is that challenge that was run on the platform that we run it on, which I'll tell you about in a second, they didn't do enough validation, and what they realized when they opened the challenge, everyone completed the challenge within a couple of hours, because they realized that the test data was actually the training data just shifted by a few pixels. It was an image-based classification approach. And so everyone found the challenge too easy. And so we didn't want it to be too easy. And that meant that we had to validate the data by making sure that the light curves made sense. We had to run a classification code just to see if it was kind of trivial. We had to make sure that the metadata weren't correlated, to see if the model that we had put in really matched observations that it was based around, for example, and to look for spurious correlations. You might naively have generated all the extragalactic objects first and then all the galactic ones, and of course then you would just have an indexing issue that we wanted to avoid. Okay. So we also then needed to make the data accessible. Now, the key thing I've mentioned is that we didn't just want astronomers to take part in this challenge. And so we actually generated a bunch of IPython notebooks, which you can see in this demo, because we knew that some people would be data scientists and not astronomers. And so they wouldn't necessarily understand redshift or right ascension and declination. And for those who had knowledge of astronomy but didn't have knowledge of classification or data science, we also wanted to tell them, these are the models we know exist. These are the ways you could potentially classify the data, so that they got a mini crash course. This is publicly available on GitHub. And so if you're interested in understanding both the data and also just how these things happen in astronomy, I would encourage you to take a look. So we contacted one of the largest data science platform companies companies called Kaggle. They have been bought by Google, but they were an independent company. And we asked them if they would host the challenge. They got so excited about the challenge, they actually gave us $25,000 prize money, which is pretty great. So we actually were able to award a first, a second, and a third prize to the winners of the challenge. And we worked with their team to make sure that the data was tested and really easy to run. We had over 1,000 teams of people participating, which by our standards was way more than we were expecting. And you can see here both the distribution of, we tried to get information on what people were doing. Were they students? Were they involved in astronomy or data science? And so we had as much information as we could get in this pie chart. And you'll see on the graph, we have the score. So everyone got a score, which I'll talk about as a function of time. And you'll notice a couple of things. So first of all, this jagged, people start off, you want to be at the bottom of this diagram. And one of the things we noticed right away was that the challenge participants spoke to each other a lot. And so we were able to see the leaderboard, how they were doing publicly, and there was a sort of private version as well so that they didn't overfit their data. But what we found is there was a lot of discussion. So people got significantly better after they started communicating with each other and sharing code and sharing information. And I like including this here because I think sometimes in astronomy and physics, we spend a lot of time being competitive with each other rather than realizing that actually sharing knowledge, even though they knew they were competing, it sort of didn't matter because they wanted to innovate and they really wanted to learn. So that's something, it says something for working in groups. There was also this very active discussion board, and it was really interesting to see that folks were able to innovate on previous methods. So in order to understand how you do, we have to figure out how you win the challenge. One of the ways we did that is by designing a metric and testing a metric. So in order to test it and design the metric, you need to say, well, what do most classifiers of astronomical objects do? Well, you can imagine you're totally uncertain, you just guess, and then you get some kind of random even distribution, every probability. So these little blocks on the x-axis, you can see the true class of, say, an object, and the predicted class, and on the y-axis you have the true class. If you were perfectly classifying the objects, of course, the true class and the predicted class would match entirely. And so your probability of classification would be 1 along the diagonal and 0 everywhere else. But you can imagine other objects where you would have a different kind of behavior. So if you only care about one object, say kilonovae, you may do very well at finding kilonovae and you have really no idea how to find anything else. So that we call the tunnel vision classifier. Or you could say, I have a cruise control. I think kilonovae are so important, I'm just going to guess that every single thing I see is a kilonova in the hopes that I'm right. So I basically just give an equal probability to all the classes. All of them would be predicted to be a kilonova. Something that's slightly more interesting is what we call the subsuming classes, which is if I think that, say, a type 1a X looks a little bit like a type 1a BG, or a type 1 core collapse supernovae looks like another, then that you would only get those two objects confused. And in fact, that's sort of what we see a lot, that you're pretty good at classifying things, but sometimes the light curves of two objects look quite similar and you get them confused. And so we decided to use just a log loss metric, which is basically taking the probability of classification and then applying a mask and then assigning a sum across all the types. So we didn't want you didn't get points if you were only good at classifying one kind of object. We really wanted to say, how good are you at classifying across the range of all the objects? And moreover, we actually weighted by the number of objects, because we know, going back to the slide in the beginning where I showed the different numbers of objects in the simulation, you don't want to get a good mark just because you're really good at classifying the most populous object. We really want to make sure that you are doing a good job of classifying everything. And it's good to see that some of the actual classification confusion matrices that you see here from the challenge reasonably well mimic all the ways we thought classifications could proceed, which is on the right-hand side. So the left-hand side is reality, and the right-hand side is a simulation. And the winner of the challenge was Carl Boone. I'll talk about that in a second. And then one of the other presenters was Major Tom. Okay, so who won and why and what did they do? So we had the winner, it ended up being an astronomer. They were a grad student. who was applying for postdocs. It wasn't clear that they were actually going to do very well. They only started performing well reasonably near the end, but then they realized, oh, actually, maybe I might be in of the chance, and then beat the others at the end. And then the next two, the second and third place, people were actually sort of an amalgamated group. So they had some interesting names. And they combined a bunch of different things. They had neural network models, and then they had gradient boosted machines. And you'll see that most people, I think in the next slide, most people actually had a kind of combination of different classifiers that they used together. And also most people did different things with the data. So here in this table, in the results paper, which has just come out on the archive, we looked at the things that made the classifiers needed to do a good job. So the first thing you need to do is the data has to handle the fact that there are many more of one type of object and very few of another. So that we call that class imbalance mitigation. And then the other thing we said was non-representativity mitigation. So the training set is normally pristine and beautiful because it's run with a low redshift spectroscopic survey, say, on a small area of the sky. And then the data itself from the Rubin Observatory will have much larger errors. And so the way you can visualize this is in this plot here from the paper, where you notice that the objects have pretty small error bars. Ignore the gray bands because those are just the gaps in the data. These have been fit with a Gaussian process interpolation. But what you want to do is you don't want to train on a series of data that are pristine and amazing, and then when you test your data, they're all so bad that you do terribly. You want to slowly degrade the good training data to look more and more like the test data, but you still have the label. So what you do in this case, you can either take that light curve and drop some observations, or just blow up the error bars. And so this is what's happening. In this case, they've also been redshifted. So it's the same object, just at a different redshift. So you can augment the training data yourself by taking different copies and making some slight changes to the training data. And you can either do that in the light curve space, or you can do that in the feature space once you have extracted features from these light curves. So before you do any kind of classification, you would say, what are the things that are important that I'm going to classify over? Is it going to be the width of the light curve, or the brightest magnitude of the light curve, etc. Okay, yeah, so this is the slide I was looking for earlier. A lot of people did this sort of Frankensteinian combination of things where they added a lot of different machine learning techniques together and then played their own methods against one another to find the best one, which was something that perhaps we might have anticipated, but I didn't necessarily expect. Okay, so what did we want a good classifier to do? So what you want is that you want the classifier to be both precise. So the precision is defined as the number of like true positives, the time that you really are true, and it's correct, divided by the sum of true positives and false positives. And then the recall, you want to also be large. So what is the true positives divided by the number of times you were correct in the true positive, or a false negative when you should have seen that something wasn't that and you classified it incorrectly. And so you want it to be in this space. You wanted to do really well in both, but often you need to trade off two things against one another, because the more precise or conservative you are, the fewer objects you'll find. So your efficiency or your recall will decrease as your precision increases. And so this plot here shows if you take a classification that you give a probability, so I think I'm 90% sure this, say, is a type 1a supernova, then I can say, well, if I'm above some threshold, I will say it is a type 1a supernova or not, if it's below a certain threshold. And as you change that threshold, your position in the precision and recall space will change. One of the things that's interesting is, of course, this changes for different kinds of objects, because some objects you really want to take them because they're so important that you want to accept them as much as you can. For example, if they're exotic, like say a kilonova, and other objects like a type 1a supernova, there are lots of them. You want to be really, really confident that you have the right object just before taking them. And so we looked at and these also change as a function of classifier, because some classifiers were better at classifying individual objects than others. one thing that I think is kind of neat is rather than saying just how did people perform and were they precise, you can actually say, well, what was common? What did they disagree on, or in terms of their classifications? And so this matrix that we show here is basically so it's as a function of all the top 10 classifiers. So these are entries to this challenge. And we looked at which of the objects did they most disagree on. So for example, if you go to the top left corner, Kyle Boone, the winner, most disagreed with the second place about the microlensing events. And that's telling you something about which of the models are difficult to classify. And if you were to sort of pair up, you would say, well, let me see what you did in this classification that I didn't do. And then you can help sort of hone your algorithms later. Okay, so another way that you can interpret or understand confusion, and this is important because as we go forward, whatever science case you are interested in, you will care most about that object. And what you don't want to do is be uncertain between one object and another. So let's use this as an example. This is taken from the winner, from Kyle Boone, and I'm showing violin plots, which you can think of as sort of a distribution in probability space, where the sort of thickest part is where the maximum is in the probability space, probability density, and then the tails are bringing you out to low probability areas. You'll notice that Kyle Boone has a violin plot that peaks at high probability, which is what you want, because of course this is the top left-hand corner, they are true 1As. And so the violin that corresponds to the 1A classification, you would like it to peak at a high probability. But if you look at 91 BGs, Kyle was actually pretty bad at classifying 91 BGs because his probability violin goes all the way from 1 to 0. So it's actually, he basically was classifying with equal probability. And this is interesting because it allows us to start for an individual classifier to tease apart, you know, why might there be those degeneracies? Is it a model issue? Is it a classification choice? Is it some features that he extracted that were not sensitive to 91 BG true light curve properties, but they were to 1As? And so we provide some of these tools that folks can actually make these for their own classifiers. I also think it's worth discussing this other class. So if you recall, we threw a bunch of data into the test sample that folks had never seen before. And we just asked them, can you label it with the class other? I haven't seen it before. And we included this because we actually were really interested in anomaly detection, because we know, again, that's what we'll have with the Rubin Observatory, lots of new things. What we hadn't fully appreciated, I think, is that people are playing to win money. And so instead of being principled and doing anomaly detection, what people did was they played the leaderboard, which means they guessed for the class 99, they guessed a probability, they saw how they performed, and then they guessed another probability. And in fact, they guessed a scheme. So what Kyle did was he took the probability of being a class other as some weighted average of the probabilities of a few different transients, because he wasn't entirely sure. And so that's quite interesting, because as you start to see, these are the violin plots for the top 3 classifiers. And you notice that the objects that were used to form the sum that became the other probability, of course, are degenerate now with the other class. So Kyle used 1AXs, type 2s, and 1BCs. And so this is also a useful thing to try and tease apart. Why did people do badly on classifying the other class? Okay, so just to summarize this little part of the talk, PLAsTiCC is a challenge that you can still participate in, actually. The data and the metrics, they're all online. You can't win any money now. But we have this huge simulation set that people can now use to test their algorithms on and come up with new and innovative tools. What we're going to do next is we're going to take the elements from all the classifiers and see if we can actually make an Uber classifier ourselves that will do really all of what we want and the best thing of what we want. You can also then ask, well, okay, why is this useful? How might we, once the telescope is operational, how might we actually use our follow-up resources? So I realized maybe it wasn't entirely clear before, and this is a huge mea culpa 30 minutes into my talk, but LSST is only scanning the sky in photometric bands. There's no spectrum on LSST, which means you can't go and take a spectrum of an object to confirm what it is. This whole enterprise is designed because this is a photometric survey. It'll give you lots of objects, but it won't tell you for sure what anything is. Of course, there are ground-based telescopes that you can use to follow up those objects and to say what they are, but we need to make sure how to use them efficiently. So this is a diagram on the top of the kinds of numbers that we're expecting and the potential resources we can get as a function of redshift with other surveys like Subaru or the Foremost survey on Vista. And so something I'm doing with postdocs and students in Toronto is using the idea of active learning, which is saying instead of having a huge data set like PLAsTiCC that we run once we have all the data for 10 years, can we start to learn how to classify on the fly? So I get data from the telescope LSST today. I then tell my ground-based telescope, please go and look at this object, and I get my label, I get my answer. And then I say, well, how well did I do, and how well can I improve my classification? So at every stage, I will be able to choose which object to follow up by a telescope. Instead of just picking, I want to pick all the 1As, I can start to say, let me pick the object to follow up that seems to be most uncertain. So if I get some probability of classification from my classifier, and it seems to me that the 1As and the type 2s are the most uncertain with each other, let me go and make sure I get that object. Do follow-up resources on that object. And so this is called active learning and allows you to build up your classifier rather than just running it as it's, training it and then running it as it's complete. And one of the things that we found is that active learning actually allows you to very rapidly improve the efficiency relative to just some standard approach where you trained your algorithm and then you never train it again. And this is work that's ongoing with Connor Shear, who I believe you all know pretty well, and Tina Peters as well. So I've simulated the data that you can run your classifiers on. I very briefly highlighted how we can actually use some of these approaches to do on-the-fly classification with active learning to allow us to use our spectroscopic resources a little bit better. So what? How do we actually use these classifications for cosmology, and why should we care if you don't necessarily do supernova science per se? Well, I like to use this example when I'm giving a talk in person. It's a little bit strange to do it online, but I really love this as a Bayesian introduction in one sentence. So if I told you that I came to my office on a dragon today, you would definitely not think I was telling the truth. However, you didn't see me and I'm in my office. So if you just use the fact that I'm in my office, if you just use the kind of likelihood that I'm in my office, then coming by dragon or coming by TTC is equally likely. You, of course, know that I didn't fly on a dragon today because you have a strong prior that dragons don't exist. And so nothing makes us understand Bayesianness more than me coming to work on a dragon. So one of the things we are going to have to do with the Rubin Observatory and with this LSST survey is do photometric cosmology when we aren't sure that each individual object in our Hubble diagram is in fact a type 1a supernova. In order to do that, we need to fold in our uncertainty rigorously in a Bayesian way, because if I apply those cuts, those thresholds that I talked about before, I know I will include some number of objects that are not type 1a supernovae. They will have a very different distance relationship because they're different objects. And so I can imagine biasing myself away from the true cosmology if I do something kind of simple. In fact, the ellipses, the contours that I'm showing you in this diagram come from work that I did on the Sloan survey, where we tried to apply this kind of analysis. And what we found was that if you just applied a cut to the Hubble diagram, you said, I'm just going to cut out all my 5 sigma objects, you can actually bias your cosmology significantly. And if you are very restrictive and you say, I want to be 99.999% certain that in fact I do have a supernova, type 1a supernova, then you've wasted all of that data because you're not going to use most of it. And so we came up with an approach, which is for those who are interested in statistics, it's just a mixture model, a Gaussian mixture model, which is Bayesian estimation applied to multiple species. And this is something that is being used by the Pan-STARRS group. And in fact, other folks have innovated a little bit as well in understanding how redshift uncertainties play a role. So we're interested, I won't go into too much detail since I'm running out of time, but we wanted to ask a bigger question. Because now that we know how we need to include the probability that something is a 1A in our analysis, or that something is whatever cosmology you're interested in, or whatever type of object you're interested in, we have to include that probability into our likelihood. But of course, we also know that there will be other things that are uncertain. For example, we're going to get a photometric redshift from the host galaxy colors. And so we are building a big probabilistic model that will include all of these different posteriors. So instead of thinking of yourself as having a, as just having a Hubble diagram, like I showed before, which is just redshift and mu, now you can imagine you really have multiple different mu's for each object that you assume. So in this case, I've assumed 3 different types. So there's a type 1a supernova, a type 1bc, and a type 2. I know that type 1as and type 1bcs and type 2s have very different properties. They don't have such a tight relationship in a distance modulus space, and they have a lot of other information, like they're much more spread out, etc., because they're not standard distance candles in the same way. And so the goal of something like Skipper, this probabilistic framework, is to say, instead of just assuming I have one kind of object and doing cosmology with that one kind of object, I now know that I both have distance modulus uncertainty, redshift uncertainty, and type uncertainty. So I really need to add the layers of this uncertainty cake together for each object. Now you can imagine how suddenly it got much more complicated, because we're not only doing cosmology with lots of objects, but there's now all these additional layers of uncertainty per object. And so what we're doing right now is trying to make sure we can run this large framework at scale, because we know we need to grow eventually to doing hundreds of thousands of objects. So that should be out shortly. But that's the sort of reason behind, the raison d'etre for all of this work and classification, is because we really want to make sure that we can do cosmology with these objects. Now, I'm going to skip over the requirements stuff because that is very interesting, but I've run out of time. But I wanted to bring you back to this plot, because it links to the Pan-STARRS diagram that I showed you before. So LSST will do incredibly at constraining, particularly the dark energy equation of state. So in the previous diagram that you saw, where we had the distance modulus difference as a function of redshift, I told you that the X and Y graphs were about 5 magnitudes up and down. Sorry, 0.5 magnitudes up and down. This scale is 5 millimagnitudes. So our uncertainty in the distance modulus relationship has gone down by orders of magnitude. And so that means that the wiggle room that you have for any dark energy model is significantly reduced. So the models that I have drawn here, these blue and yellow lines, they're actually models that are within the error bars of current acceptable data, and we will completely rule them out with the Rubin Observatory. So that's something exciting. If you're interested in dark energy, there's a lot of exciting stuff that we're going to be able to do with the samples that are coming from the Rubin Observatory, if we can get our systematics right. So just right at the end, I know that I'm speaking to a Canadian audience, and so I wanted to just understand how we fit into the Rubin Observatory. So it's an American project, and previously it was the case that you had to buy in to this observatory through your institution, and then you could work with an advisor who did that. But subsequently in 2018, the Rubin Observatory decided to make the international collaborators able to buy in via in-kind. So Can you provide computing resources? Do you have staff that you can use to work on the experiment? Can you host, for example, can you host an archive of data? So I was part of a group, and I'm still part of the group leading our efforts to get into this. So we know that we need to be part of the party. A lot of people are working in Canada are working on Rubin Observatory data products, and we want to make sure that we have the opportunity to be a player in that game. So that led us to initially make a bid via the CFI funding proposal to develop a science platform. We called it CLASP, or the Canadian LSST Advanced Science Platform, which would include the ability to do software, develop software for LSST science to be used both in Canada and internationally. So we weren't funded in this most recent round of the CFI grant that's just come out. However, in developing the large proposal for access to the telescope, the Canadian access to the telescope, we actually have developed a proposal that includes building software support, so having postdoctoral and software engineering support over the next 10 years through other in-kind contributions and cash contributions from different universities. So the good thing is that we are reshaping our proposal and putting it forward to the Rubin project to enable Canadians to have access to the data. And it will also mean that we will have positions available in the next few years and ongoing for about 10 years. We will have positions for postdocs and for software engineers to get engaged in the project. So if you are a grad student and you're going to be looking to move on from your PhD program eventually to a postdoctoral position, these are the kinds of things that I want to keep on your radar to remain excited about the Rubin Observatory. So this has been a super whirlwind tour in understanding and hopefully getting you excited by some of the challenges in both classification of photometric data with the Rubin Observatory, what we can do with that when we're there, and how we can actually use statistical techniques to get out the cosmology that we want from the analysis. And I really want you to be excited about Canadian participation in the Rubin Observatory because it's coming in a couple of years. There's so much work to be done. And I really think that Canada can continue to play a really good, big role, especially with some of the innovative ideas and projects that I know some of you are already doing. So I'll stop and take questions now. Thanks.
Thank you very much for this nice talk. If you appreciated the talk, please let us know in the Zoom chat, or if you're watching on YouTube, let us know in the YouTube chat. I'll share the Zoom chat transcript with Professor Hložek after the talk. So please let her know how much you enjoyed it, if you did. And if you would like to ask a question in Zoom, please use the raise hand feature. Just go to more and then hit the little raise hand icon. It'll move your name up to the top and I'll pick you off one by one. If you would like to ask a question on YouTube, please type it into the chat and my associate will pass it on to me. There is one question that is already there in the Zoom chat, which I presume is to be asked by me because this person did not raise their hand. So the question is, in light of the SN classification challenges, what is your view of the current H0 tension, the Hubble constant tension?
Okay, so that's a great question. Thank you. There are a couple of things. So the first thing is the tension in H0 is something that is exists in data that have been classified spectroscopically, right? So all of the objects are known to be type 1 and supernovae, and the H0 challenge, the difference is that the low redshift distance indicators disagrees with the high redshift distance indicators. So the CMB, the baryon acoustic oscillations, etc. There's a difference in the H0 value that they prefer. It's tricky because both groups have done a lot of work to try and understand their systematics. The kinds of systematics you get from the supernova side are, have I calibrated my period luminosity relationship correctly? Do I understand all of the systematics and how they propagate forward? From the CMB side, H0 is an inferred parameter, and so if there's something that my analysis might suggest the value should be higher rather than lower. That's tricky because we now have evidence that independent groups, so the Atacama Cosmology Telescope that I'm involved in and Planck, we've analyzed our data completely separately, whereas previously most people would sort of use Planck as an anchor. And so if we analyze the data completely separately, we still get a consistent value. So the CMB really does disagree. In light of the classification challenges, I would say the good thing is we will have so much more data that we'll be able to do cosmology. However, the very low redshift objects that are the ones giving you the H0 tension, that's really not what LSST will be focusing on, because those low redshift objects are not the same ones that we're using for LSST. However, I do think it will teach us more about supernovae in general and allow us to understand things like dust contamination and intrinsic variations in the objects. So we'll learn more about supernovae, but we won't find new objects to do the distance ladder indicators. Those already, already exist. It was a very long.
Thank you. We have a couple more questions already in the lineup. The next question will come from Professor Daryl Haggard. I have to allow you to unmute. I forgot to click that one. Professor Haggard, could you please unmute yourself, ask your question, turn on your video if you like?
Thank you. Thanks, Bill. Hi, Renee. Thank you very much for the great talk. I don't know whether this is a question that I missed in your talk, but what is the intellectual property of all of those codes that were written or created during the data challenges? Like, who owns those things? Does it come back to the collaboration and get worked into the software that's developed? How does that work?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the codes themselves have been sort of put on GitHub for the other people. So in the write-up that we put up, we're submitting to the journal now, and we're going to include those authors if they're interested. If we decide to put some of their bits inside our own code, what we would need to do is, first of all, check if they've used a Creative Commons license, cite them at every stage. But the hope, I think, is that we also will be able to add them as external collaborators on papers and that sort of thing, because we obviously, you want to make sure that you're giving good attribution. But in general, one of the cool thing about this is that people put their code online and really want the recognition. In fact, the only IP issue that we had is that, so I was the PI of PLAsTiCC, which means I signed the contract with Kaggle. And the only thing that Kaggle said is I am not allowed to employ the winner at the University of Toronto because they don't like you to use this as a recruitment tool. So for the next 5 years, I can't employ Carl Bloom, which is okay because he has a fellowship, so that's fine. But yeah. I should also say that one of the reasons for pushing for Canadian access to LSST, because a lot of people say, well, the data will be made public eventually. But I should just stress, if you aren't thinking about this, the volumes of data are so large that in fact, you're not going to be able to download a data file like you do with Sloan and then write your own code to do something. You're going to have to do a lot of processing using code on a platform. And all of the codes that are developed within the desk, including all of this stuff, unless we make it public, like the simulations are public, the code that we use to do the analysis, that is proprietary. And so if we're not in the Rubin Observatory, then a lot of the codes that you need to get running won't necessarily be available if you're interested in processing. And so that's one of the reasons to get in now and not just wait for some huge data table.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Daryl, please lower your hand if you're done with your question. The next question will come from Professor Adrian Liu. Adrian?
Hi, thanks for a great talk. So I was curious about the, I think you called it scripts, the classification
Skipper
object type thing. So how did you decide which object classes to throw in there? Like, did you just say, let's just throw in as many as you possibly can, and the things that are very unlikely are going to be downweighted anyway, or was there some kind of judgment call there?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. We've sort of tried to design it as independent. Right now, actually, we only have 3 classes. So we took a huge downstep from PLASTiCC, and we just took the 3 most populous classes that we already know about. But actually, what you would really want is to be able to have this Überschied cake. And that's some of the testing that we're doing now, is when does it become totally infeasible? Like at some point you say, well, if I have to crunch all these supernovae through something that's going to take me 10 weeks to run, then it isn't worthwhile. And I think that's where a lot of innovation has to happen computationally, which is something I'm learning a little bit about. But yeah, at the moment we just did the 3 most populous, but I think it would be useful to ask what is the information content of each of the objects, and can I use that as a criteria for including them or not?
Great, thank you.
Okay, I don't see any more raised hands at the moment. If you have a question, please raise your hand. And if not, maybe I can wrap things up. But before I do, I just want to encourage everyone who is not a tenured or tenure track faculty member in the audience to stick around, because there will be an Applicolloque starting in just a couple of minutes. Professor Hložek has gracefully agreed to stick around and spread her wisdom for a little bit longer with you. And I don't see any more questions in the chat or raised hands, and we're at time anyway. So I'll just wrap up. So that concludes this edition of the Physical Society Colloquium. Thanks to all who have joined us.